If you would turn with me today, you can see the topic up on the board. I hope some of you all came prepared because I kind of yelled out in the last class about what we're going to be talking about. If you turn to Psalm 24, no, I'm saying that wrong. Yeah. Psalm 24, verse 7. We're going to read from there just to kind of get started. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. I thought that'd be a good way to get started. How many of y'all looked up verses like I asked? Am I allowed to ask a question like that? Raise your hands. Maybe I shouldn't. I see some little hands. Thank you very much for that. If you're sitting on your hands, not so much thanks. But how many verses did you write down what they were about, or did you just look up 10? Some of y'all wrote down what they were about. So I want to ask as we go along. Sometimes you may have a verse ready. I'm just kind of looking, trying to see who might have some for that. The idea behind this is that there's no way to do. I could probably do 4 classes on this topic, like an exhaustive study, not like an exhausting study. We get that's different, but an exhaustive study on glory would probably take at least 4 classes, and we don't have time for that. This is a one-off class. The interesting thing about Wednesday one-time classes is that if I go too fast, I can't start on the stuff from next lesson. If I have too much material, I just run out. So, we'll just end, and then you'll never know how it ends. So my purpose isn't to try to tell you everything that the Bible teaches about the word glory, because there's something like 500 verses that have to do with glory, that mention specifically glory. There is, I think, let's see here, 339 times in the New American Standard Bible that it specifically says the word glory. Glorifying, glorify, glorious, glorified. That's like another 100 times, okay? Maybe 115 times that the Bible mentions some version of the word glory. So we're not going to cover all those, right? But I do want to cover 4 basic areas somewhat. And we're only doing this because it's not a recycled Bible lesson, Bible study. I haven't studied this before. I've been meaning to. I had a couple of verses written down by this next verse we're going to read, and I thought, well, you know what? I'll just do that. I've been wanting to do it, and that's why you're getting to do this now. And if it goes well, great. If it doesn't, I'm sorry. But hopefully you will use this as you read the Bible later on. You see the word glory, maybe it'll mean something to you, or maybe you'll go further in your own study. If you would look at Isaiah 43:7. Isaiah 43:7. This is sort of the purpose behind this, my fascination with it. Isaiah 43:7. Everyone who is called by my name, and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made. Now, the context, he's talking about Israel. He's not necessarily talking about us. But if you read the chapter, there's a lot in there that applies to all people. And if you think about this verse, everyone who is called by my name, okay, well, we realize we're talking about Israel, but that's what we say about us, right? We're called after his name, literally Christian, but and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even who I have made. Okay, so the last part, who I have formed and who I have made. Who's left out of that? Is anybody in this room left out of that? No. So that's why I really feel like one of the things that I like about this verse is if somebody that you are talking to, working with, struggles, what's my purpose? You ever heard anybody say, I don't feel like my life has any meaning. I don't know what I should do with my life. I don't know, like, what's the purpose of even being here? This is a good verse to use. Well, what's our purpose? We were created for God's glory. So what does that mean? What do I then need to do with my life? What would my purpose be? Well, it would be to give glory to God or to glorify God, right? Or whatever that means. And that's what we're going to try to cover. So the word it's interesting, how many different languages the Bible's background might be, right? But in Greek, Hebrew, Latin, even English, the word works kind of the same way. Beauty. Think of the word beauty. I'm not saying that's a synonym for glory necessarily. It can be, but just the English part of it, grammatically. If something has beauty, you might say it is what? Oh, I like gorgeous. Yeah, use the same word. I like it. You're exactly right. If we're using the word beauty, though, like you would say beauty, and so it is beautiful, right? Beauty, beautiful. If it already has beauty and you adorn it in some way, you might what? Beautify it, right? I want to do something to the streetscape in front of us. We might say, well, I'm going to beautify the roadscape, right? The word glory works the same way. It's the same exact word, just the way beauty works for us in all of those other languages. There is one other, kind of a connection word when you get into a whole different thing. I'll talk about that a little later on, that more means clarity, clarify, but we'll get to that. Mostly, the word works the same exact way in all the languages translated, and you can't do that with a lot of things, right? Like think about handsome. Can you do that with handsome? Beauty, you can see it's like, oh, I'm handsoming. It doesn't work, right? So it's a fairly unique word, but it works that way in all four languages. Have you ever, Latin, I don't know, I'm not a linguist, right? I don't pretend to be. Have you ever heard that song, the Christmas song? What is it, where they go, angels we have heard on high, like, angels we have heard on high. What's the chorus? Gloria, right? In excelsis Deo, that's the Latin word for glory, Gloria. So it's directly connected. Does that make sense? In excelsis Deo means to God in the highest, I believe, okay? So, but again, vast word, because once the word becomes associated with God, what happens to it? If God has glory or is glorious, well, then all these attributes come along with it. Can you think of synonyms that we often think about with the word glory? Any synonyms? What's that? Majesty. Majesty, yes, absolutely. Think of other words. Fame. Thank you. Who said that? Did you say that one? Thank you. Did I talk to you about this? I don't think I did. Okay, good. Fame. Anybody else have another?
Something awe-inspiring or
awe-inspiring, right? All of these things become synonyms for glory because those are all attributes that the Bible makes of God. And the Bible having been around for a couple of thousand years, right? When we think about this, those become attributes. They don't, in the language necessarily, those aren't necessarily synonyms. There's a couple of things that in, whether it's Greek or Hebrew, glory lends itself to. You might even say like an attribute of glory. There are a couple of things, we're going to talk about those, but those synonyms are all over the Bible. You can look at it all the time. There's not necessarily just one meaning all the time with glory, but we can't cover all of that. You could look at a number of different things. Did any of you look up a Bible verse that had to do with glory being used to describe something very earthly? Nothing to do with deity, nothing to do with God. Did you see any verses in the Bible? Yes, sir.
James 1, 9 and 10.
What does it say?
But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation.
Okay, great. So glory in that position, even as a humble, lowly man, glory in that position, and the rich man glory in your humiliation, right? That's not necessarily saying, it almost sounds the opposite of being lifted up or majestic, right? Glory in your humility, or one way or the other, right? Okay, does anybody have a very physical thing? And yes?
So glory was used in context of earthly kings a lot.
It was. Earthly kings and even earthly kingdoms. If you remember where Satan took Christ up to the mountain, the temptation. I was looking for my verse here on that. Matthew 4:8 would be one of those. It talks about looking out on the kingdoms in their glory. You think it's talking about in their, godliness? It's not talking about that at all, right? It's just in their glory. So there's a lot of times in the Bible, there's a verse, 1 Corinthians 15, 40 to 41, it talks about the moon has its glory, and the sun has its glory, and the earth has its glory. And it's not talking about something majestic at all. Somebody look at Matthew 6, 28 and 29. Matthew 6, 28 and 29. Tell me, did anybody have this one written down? You may have already. Tell me what it's talking about. Lily of the flowers in the field, and it's comparing it to clothing, right? Why would you worry about these things? Because of the glory of clothing or of flowers. It doesn't have to mean some virtue necessarily of God. Now, that said, I don't know that I could find one negative connotation about glory at all in the Bible, all right? So it is definitely a positive thing. Yes?
Chapter 21 of Revelation talks about the new Jerusalem, which is in heaven, and it describes it as full of glory. It also says the city does not need the sun, for the glory of God gives it light.
Great transition. So the glory of God gives it light. We're going to talk about how glory directly connects to God. I wanted to mention one other thing. Proverbs 19:11. You don't have to turn there, but it actually talks about just the quality of a person. He's doing something. I forget the context, and basically it says, and he can glory in that character trait. Isn't that nice? And it's not a big deal, pious one. Somebody might look at that, and you could yell it out in a minute. So we're going to talk about 4 different areas: definitions, God's glory, Christ in regard to glory, and then us in regard to that glory. Synonyms, we've talked about those a lot: honor, renown, a divine quality, manifestation of God, splendor. Thayer's talks about what evokes a good opinion, all right? What evokes a good opinion. One of the things I want you to carry away from this class when we're talking about the word itself is 2 very basic concepts. One, majorly Old Testament, but some in the New Testament. The second one, majorly in the New Testament, but some in the Old Testament, okay? And the 2 concepts are that glory, almost always, the attributes of glory, regardless of the synonyms that we kind of assign to it, one has to do with to be heavy. That's strange, to be heavy. But if you think about it, in fact, there's a verse, remember when in Exodus 17, they lifted Moses' hands up, and as long as his hands were up, then they were winning. If his hands were lowered, then they wouldn't, and they propped him up on some rocks. It says his hands became, and in your Bibles, I'm 99% sure it says heavy, same exact word as glory, glorious. Isn't that strange, right? That doesn't happen very often, but that's a huge connotation in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, of glory. God's heavy presence, God's massive presence. Does that make sense? And you could see how that connotation would come true, would be accurate. This idea of being heavy. Look at somebody look up 2 Corinthians 4:17 for me. Yes, 2 Corinthians 4:17. Read it out loud for me if you don't mind.
For this life, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison.
An eternal weight of glory. You see how that, even in the New Testament, it hints towards that. So the Old Testament, very clear, very much a connotation, is this idea, that's where the word comes from, is to be heavy. New Testament, though, still talks about glory having a weight, a more than intangible, something tangible about that, right? And we can see with a lot of the Bible, the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid, right? Luke 2, I think, talking about the birth of Christ. You can see when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, and they don't want any part of this thing, it's too much for them to bear. The cloud was there, but the glory of God, it talks about over and over again, was this very intimidating presence for them that was the glory of God. Was God showing them his full self? No, right? No. But this part of him, this glory of him, was overwhelming for them. The second thing, if you only remember 2 qualities of glory from this study, we've got not that much time. So if you just remember one other thing, it would be that the most accurate translation of glory in the English language would be similar to recognize or recognition, okay? That you think about a person's reputation. Not so much, there is a word again, in fact, I think I got it right here. I was going to mention the, again, not a linguist, but Latin Vulgate of the Greek word is translated as clarifico, which basically means clarity, meaning or to clarify, meaning you get a really specific picture in your mind and you can picture that, right? Well, you could see recognition even in that as well. If I know David Roper, so when I'm here and he appears in my vision, I have a clear picture in my mind of what he looks like, who he is, so I know him. Now, that's just the little tiniest version of recognition. How do we use the word recognition in a bigger way?
The words. If you recognize someone's excellence in their field or...
Exactly. This idea that you could be extolling them, right? You can be lifting them up in a way that they deserve recognition. That is actually the more accurate way of using this word glorify. And you can see that, or glory, you can see that throughout the Bible, obviously. So we might say, if you glorify God, you're promoting recognition of him, okay? You might say, this would be almost vulgar. I wouldn't say this, right? Advertising, right? Obviously, we think more highly of this topic than mere advertising, but this promotion, this promoting, when we talk about, and we'll get to it here hopefully if I talk fast enough, the idea that if we are a reflection of Christ in the world, what are we doing with his reputation? We're promoting that, right? We are continuing that. We are bolstering that. And you can see that over and over. So we'll get to some actual verses. Let's look at God's glory first. 2 Peter 1:17. We read the first verse about the King of glory. That's sort of a name for God. 2 Peter 1:17. God is called the majestic glory. That's how closely associated God is with his glory. It's a bit like thinking about how someone can't really be separated from their own presence, right? Is God his glory? Well, not exactly, but can God be separated from that? And conceptually, no. It's impossible because the concept is so close to who he is, it becomes part of God's attributes. Just like, since he's perfect, his glory is also perfect. Would my glory ever be perfect? No, well, maybe after death. But like here, no, because I am very imperfect. So is my reputation ever going to be perfect? No, even if I have a good reputation, it's probably not perfect. Is God's reputation perfect? Yes, to the point that you can't separate it because God is perfect. Therefore, everything about God is perfect, and you can't really separate that. But that weighty presence, you might say, is part of him. Look at Exodus 24. We'll look at verse 15. We'll read a little bit. Then Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud, and to the eyes of the sons of Israel the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So in a sense, is glory tangible? It has more than mere just word choice, right? It's not just a compliment we give to God. It's like a consuming fire. That is a perfect type of glory, right? That is a glory that can be reflected in Moses' face later on because it is so big. That's overwhelming to me to think about. That the reputation of God, the weight of God that he carries with him, not God himself, but that which follows God is so massive and so weighty and like a consuming fire that it can be felt. Have you ever thought about the idea, Alan Moeller, I can pick on him. They're in the front row, so it's easy for me. I can see their faces when I say something I don't like. Alan, his countenance just lights up a room. Have you ever heard that phrase? This lights up the room, right? That's Shelby. She just lights up a room when she goes. now think about that times a billion, right? That's the glory of God, lighting up everything. It's amazing to me. Okay, so this in Exodus, it could say that the Lord rested, or the appearance of the Lord was like a fire, but it doesn't say that. It says that the glory of the Lord rested there, and that the appearance of the glory of the Lord. So it's a little distinguishing factor that I just find fascinating throughout the Bible. Okay, and then of course we all know the story of Moses asking God in chapter 33, when chapter 33 verse 18, eventually God's going to show Moses kind of a version of himself. And what does it say that he did? How did he show himself to Moses? Anybody remember? He put his hand, he hid Moses sort of against a rock, and he put his hand over it, and then it says the glory of the Lord went by. But look at verse 18. Somebody read out loud verse 18 about the question that Moses asks, or the statement that he makes. What does it say? 33:18. Please, thank you, Arlene. Thank you, but please show me your glory. You're not going to be able to take it. I'll put my hand here. I'll have my glory pass in front of you. You're not seeing God, except that it's so inseparable. God is so inseparable from his glory that that's what he can see and show. So that visible, tangible presence of God is there. You can't separate one from the other. Let's look at an example. This will be the last thing we talk about, I think, with God's presence. 1 Samuel 4:21. 1 Samuel 4, we'll look in verse 21. So in this story, they bring out the ark. They take the ark out in front of them for this battle, and they lose the battle, and they lose the ark. Okay? And so if you don't read this maybe just right, it can be a little confusing, just pulling out of context here. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because her father-in-law and her husband." She said, in verse 22, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken." Is she talking about the ark, or is she talking about God? Both, I get it. What's the glory she's talking about there? My opinion, it's not the ark. They didn't lose because they lost the ark because God had left them. This was not what God wanted. They were suffering because God had departed. My point being, that's how closely related God is to his glory, that they're the same. Even in the Bible, they're referenced often in the same. Joseph, yes?
I was just saying, the symbolism of it, when the law was given, God told them that that's where he would speak with them, was at the ark. So that's kind of the symbol of the ark maybe is their connection with God was something.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. That was their connection with God. Okay, so there's so many examples in the Old Testament of glory of God appearing in a visible, tangible way, that the weighty presence of God. Just think about it, the weighty presence of God in the Old Testament. Now let's look more at glory as it relates to Jesus. 1 Corinthians 2:8. 1 Corinthians 2:8 says that Christ, it calls him the Lord of glory. Okay, similar language to what we saw earlier, the King of glory, the Lord of glory. Colossians 1:27. You all remember when we went through the Waldron book, Christ in You, the Hope of Glory? I think that's what, you remember what it's called? That was from this verse, Colossians 1:27, the hope of glory. When we think about the King of glory, you can't really separate God's attributes from himself. That's a name, you might say a descriptive name of God, a descriptive name of Christ. The Lord of glory, the hope of glory. Again, very closely tied to glory itself. Can anyone think of a similar time in the New Testament where glory was sort of this tangible, heavy, weighted thing reflected in the situation where Christ was involved? Can you think about an example in the New Testament? The Transfiguration. If you want to go to Luke 9, let's go over there real quick. Luke 9. 29 to 32. Luke 9. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, Jesus, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw Jesus' glory and the two men standing with him. And then they went on from there. Here's what we need to do. I think that's almost identical to probably how the Israelites felt when they were in the presence of that weighty presence of God, reflected off of Moses' face. Clearly, this was something different here, right? It's not really all the way, the normal way that Christ talks about glory, or even the New Testament talks about glory. It's more like reputation I was talking about, right? But in this case, clearly, they see it. It's visible. And it's one of the few times that happens in the New Testament. So usually this idea, you might say, of publicizing or promoting is there. Let's look at John 12. Somebody read John 12, 28. If you would, read it loud for me, please. John 12, 28. Yes, sir. Thanks, Al.
Verse 28, you said?
Yes, sir.
Father, glorify your name. And the voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again.
I have glorified it. I have promoted it. I have spread it. I have put it out there, and I will do it again. Okay? That's really kind of the idea there. Not, I have served myself. I have made myself feel big, right? That's not it at all. He's talking about, I have glorified it. I have put it out there. Now, he puts it out there with Christ a lot of the time. Let's look at John 8, 54, nearby there. John 8. Says, Jesus answered, verse 54, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And I think if we skip down, we could also look at verse 50 that was leading into that. Verse 50, Jesus again speaking, but I do not seek my glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Talking about God. And then in verse 54, if I glorify myself, it's nothing. So think about this relationship. God glorifies Christ so that as Christ, meaning promotes the reputation of Christ, helps with some of these miraculous things we see, promotes Christ. In return, what does that do for God? It reflects and promotes who God is and his reputation and his persona. Does that make sense? Does that make some sense? Okay. Yes. Honor, good. Not good synonym. Yep, that's a good synonym, absolutely. In John 13, it says, verse 31, 32, therefore when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him, Jesus, in himself, and will glorify him immediately. So he's saying, if Jesus is glorified, then God is glorified in Jesus. And if God is glorified in Jesus, then God will also continue to glorify Jesus, promote Jesus, extol Jesus. Does that make sense? Okay. And I realize I'm hurrying a little bit because I have 2 points to make. One is that in John 17, if you look at John 17, verse 4, it says, let's see. I glorified you on the earth by how? Accomplishing or finishing the work which you gave me to do. So, our first verse from Isaiah said that our purpose was to glorify God. Everyone who was created by God, purpose was glorified to God. What does it say here that Jesus is saying, I glorified you on the earth? How? How did I adorn God? How did I beautify God? How did I glorify God, right? By accomplishing the work he gave me to do. So circling back then, what does that mean for us? if we can look at Jesus saying that, and you know, by the way, that whole section where when in Philippians 2:5-11, when it says that, you know, Jesus' name will be above all names, and it's one of the most beautiful passages. I was going to read it. At the end, it says, all this happened to the glory of God. To the glory. That's what Jesus' purpose was, is to glorify God to us, to promote, you might say, God to us, to save us, obviously, for God, through God, as part of God's plan. So how do we do that? There's a lot of verses about it. We don't need to go through all of them, but Romans 3:23 we quote all the time. What does it say? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are not perfect. We fall short of this glory. Isaiah 43:7 we've mentioned. We were created for God's glory. We fall short. And then there's all these little verses about, like 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 6:20. For you have been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body. Yes?
John 17:22, I think's an interesting one. It says, the glory which you have given to me, I have given to them, that they may be one.
Exactly. So that reflection, that passing on went from Christ to the apostles, to the disciples, to others here, that it continues in just that way. The verse about the face in the mirror, I believe that was one of them that, what's that? 1 Corinthians 13, maybe you might have it there. I feel like that was one of them that talked about that if you turn it around and you don't see that anymore, you forget what it was. Then there's these practical things about how do we glorify God. Jesus one time talked about the lepers that he healed. Remember that in Luke 17 says, was no one found who returned to give glory except this foreigner? That over and over and over, I promise you, once you start looking for this concept, the Bible is just replete with the concept of glory and what that means. Now, I talked this whole time. You all were very kind. Thank you. If I did this more regularly, maybe I would break up my time better. But I've got tons of things I can talk about odd little other things in the Bible that we often say are glory, where the Bible clearly makes a delineation. Honor, glory, strength, glory. There are verses that mention both of those together in a number of times. But do you have any questions before we're done? Anybody? Comments? Anything else? Roy? Okay. All right. Yeah.
I was just going to read from 2 Corinthians, one of the ones I found, where it's talking about the glory of the new covenant. As you said, reflection a few times. It says, nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all with unveiled face behold in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Did you hear that? That in the image, we're being transformed from glory to glory in the Spirit of the Lord. So the glory of God to Christ, reflected in Christ. The glory of Christ to us, reflected in us. And how is it reflected in us? By obeying God and doing what He's asked us to do. Thank you all. I appreciate your what would I even call that? Yeah, attention? Okay, good. I was going to say indulgence. I don't know what the word would be. Thank you very much.